It was Halloween night, and the house was filled with the twinkling of lanterns, their creepy smiles casting an orange light on the walls. My mother-in-law, Isabella, had invited me to help with the decorations since my wife was out of town for work. In her tight black dress and witch's hat, she looked like a movie star. Her presence was always commanding, but today there was something different, almost magnetic about her. We worked side by side in the dim light, our hands occasionally touching as we hung garlands and arranged decorations. Every time our fingers touched, I felt an uncontrollable shiver run down my spine. It was a strange mixture of excitement and guilt. I loved my wife, but Isabella's attraction that night was undeniable. There was something in the air, maybe the wine, maybe the night itself, that seemed to blur the lines of propriety. The wine flowed easily as we worked, and the glasses emptied faster than I had anticipated. We talked about everything and nothing. My wife, Isabella's memories of Halloween when she was little, the funny costumes my wife had worn as a child. With each passing moment, the atmosphere became more and more casual, more and more intimate. I noticed how her laughter tightened, how her eyes seemed to linger on me a little longer than necessary. By the time we finished decorating the house, it was past midnight. We sat on the living room floor, surrounded by empty wine bottles and the soft light of the lanterns. I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine, the faint scent of her perfume enveloping me. There was a tension between us that had been building all evening. I knew it was wrong, but at that moment, I didn't care. I leaned toward her, my heart pounding in my chest, and our faces came within inches of each other. There was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but also something else, something tantalizing. But no sooner had our lips met than a loud sound ruined the moment. We both jumped up, turning our heads in the direction of the sound. The sound was coming from the backyard. Isabella's eyes widened, and she stood up quickly, her dress rippling as she moved. I followed her, my heart still pounding, but now for a completely different reason. We reached the back door, and the cold night air enveloped us as we stepped outside. The backyard was dark, the only light coming from the lanterns inside the house. We moved forward cautiously, scrutinizing the shadows for any sign of movement. And then we saw the glint of metal on the grass. I knelt down, picked it up, and felt my stomach churn. It was my father-in-law's watch. The glass dial cracked, and the leather strap smeared with something dark. Blood. Isabella gasped, bringing her hand up to her mouth. I stood up, holding the watch between us, realizing the reality of the situation. My father-in-law was supposed to be out of town, as was my wife. What was his watch doing here? And why was there blood on it? "We can't tell anyone about this," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at me, her eyes widening with fear. "Not until we know what's going on." I nodded, and the watch grew heavy in my hand. There was something about the way she was looking at me in that moment, a mixture of fear and trust that made me want to protect her. I slipped the watch into my pocket, and we walked back into the house, closing the door behind us. The house was almost suffocatingly warm, the holiday decorations suddenly out of place. We sat down in the living room again, and there was a silence between us, filled with unspoken words. The connection between us had changed, deepened. It was no longer just about sneaking glances or almost kissing. It was about the secret we now shared, a secret that was both frightening and strangely intimate. I could feel the tension between us, stronger now, and the lines between good and evil were blurrier than ever. "Thank you," Isabella said quietly, meeting my eyes, "for being here, for everything." I reached out and covered her palm with mine. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice steady despite the confusion reigning inside me. "I promise." She smiled gratefully at me, her fingers wrapped around mine. The moment was heavy, filled with emotions I couldn't name. I knew that what had almost happened between us wasn't just the result of wine or the night. It was something real, something that scared me as much as it excited me. The next few days passed in confusion and mystery. My father-in-law didn't come home as expected, and there was no word from him. Isabella and I spoke in raised tones, our conversations constantly returning to clocks, blood, and unanswered questions. We were cautious of those around us, trying to make sure no one noticed the unease that lurked on the surface. One night, a few days after Halloween, Isabella called me. Her voice shook, and I could hear the fear in her words. "Can you come over? I think someone was in the house." I didn't hesitate. I drove to the car, thoughts of possibilities flashing through my mind. When I pulled up, Isabella was standing in the doorway, her face pale. She led me inside and pointed to the living room. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the wind. There was a note on the coffee table, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. "Don't interfere." My blood ran cold in my veins as I read the note. I looked at Isabella, and her eyes widened with fear. Without thinking, I pulled her to me and pressed her against me. She trembled as she pressed against me, and I could feel her heart beating fast and uncertain. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "I'll protect you." She pulled away slightly, her eyes searching mine. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Why are you risking so much for me?" I hesitated, the words stuck in my throat. Truth be told, I didn't know. Or maybe I did know, but I wasn't ready to admit it, not to her, not to myself. Instead, I simply said, "Because you don't have to go through this alone." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought the world had narrowed to the two of us. The danger, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it was gone. Only the connection between us remained. She leaned down and pressed her lips to mine, and this time I didn't pull away. The kiss was soft, tentative, but filled with all the emotions we'd been holding back. It was a release, a moment of comfort in the midst of chaos. When we finally pulled away, she rested her forehead against mine, her eyes closed. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let anything happen to her. No matter what happened, whoever was behind the threats, I would do everything in my power to keep her safe. Even if it takes crossing a line I never dreamed possible. The days that followed were tense. Isabella and I were cautious, constantly looking over our shoulder to see if we were being followed. The note was a warning, but it didn't deter us. Fear brought us closer together, and we felt both dangerous and inevitable. One evening, as we sat in her kitchen, going over the few clues we had in our minds, Isabella looked at me, her eyes full of determination. "We have to find out what happened to him," she said, her voice firm. "We can't keep living like this, waiting, wondering. We need answers." I nodded, realizing she was right. The uncertainty was eating away at us. The fear of the unknown was scarier than any truth we might discover. Together, we started piecing together the crumbs of information we had: the watch, the blood, the note. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As we worked, the tension remained between us, a constant undercurrent that neither of us recognized, but both of us felt. The kisses we shared were brief moments, brief respites from the fear that had become our constant companion. I knew it was wrong, knew that what we were doing couldn't be anything more than what it was. But in those moments, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way she looked at me, the way she made me feel needed, wanted, important. One evening, we got a break. A neighbor mentioned seeing a car parked outside the house on Halloween night, a car that didn't belong to anyone on the street. It was a small clue, but it was something. We started asking questions, trying to figure out who might have been following Isabella, who might have left the note. The deeper we dug, the more dangerous it became. It became clear that whoever was behind this didn't want us to know the truth. There were more notes, more threats, each one scarier than the last. But despite the danger, despite the fear, I couldn't leave. I was too deeply immersed, not only in the mystery, but in my feelings for Isabella. One evening, as we sat together in the dim light of her living room, Isabella looked at me, her eyes filled with both fear and something else, something that made my heart ache. "I don't know what I would do without you," she said quietly, placing her hand on my cheek. I covered her hand with mine and ran my thumb over her skin. "You don't have to find out," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." She smiled, a sad, grateful smile, and leaned in, meeting my lips with hers. The kiss was slow, filled with all the words we couldn't say. In that moment, I realized no matter what happened, no matter what the future held, I would do anything to protect her, to keep her safe, even if I had to lose everything else to do it. The night we finally learned the truth was both a relief and a new kind of horror. The one behind the threats, the one who had been following us, was someone we had in no way expected: a family friend, a man who was close to Isabella's husband. He had learned of Isabella's husband's infidelity and, driven by a twisted sense of loyalty, decided to punish Isabella for her husband's sins. Confronting him was terrifying. He was unhinged, his anger and obsession clear in every word. But Isabella and I stood together, not letting him control us any longer. The police were called, and he was taken away, and his threats were finally over. Afterward, we felt both relief and loss. The danger was gone, but so was the strong bond that bound us together. Isabella and I realized that what we had would never last, that the bond we had formed in the midst of fear and danger could not survive the light of day. We quietly said our goodbyes. The love we shared was unspoken but clear. It was a love born out of fear, out of necessity, and though it was real, it could not last. I left that day with a heavy heart, knowing I had done the right thing, even if it meant losing her. Now, as I sit here writing these lines, I can't help but think back to that Halloween night, the night that changed everything. The night that brought us together, even if only briefly. Her smile, the touch of her lips on mine, the way she looked at me with fear and trust, I will always carry all of that with me. It's a glimpse in the darkness, a moment of light in a time of fear. And though it's over, I will always be grateful for the time we had, for the love we shared, however fleeting it may have been.